As Russia's invasion of Ukraine drags on, becoming even more brutal, Vladimir Putin is looking really isolated on the world stage. But he does have one very powerful friend, Xi Jinping, his Chinese counterpart. China has avoided any criticism of Russia so far in this war, and it's even been providing quite significant diplomatic backing. Now there's speculation that it could go further, even providing military support to Russia. I wanted to find out more about this, so I spoke to Bonnie Glaser. She's one of America's foremost experts on Chinese foreign policy, and she's based at the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C. I started by asking her, how important a moment is this for China in its relations, not just with Russia, but with the West?
I think this is a very pivotal moment for China in its foreign policy, and particularly for Xi Jinping, who has been in office for 10 years, but I think has not yet faced the kind of choices that he faces today. China has in the past tried to position itself between Russia and the United States, and increasingly Xi Jinping views Putin and Moscow is a very important strategic partner, but China has always valued its relationship with the United States and tried to avoid taking any action that would really severely damage its ties with the United States. But I think that Xi Jinping believes that the United States is now implacably hostile toward China. He saw this start under the Republicans in the Trump administration and now continue under the Biden administration. And I think he has therefore attached more value to Russia and has tilted quite decisively towards toward Russia in this war in Ukraine.
Now, why don't we just for a moment go into some of the background, because you mentioned how China has been strengthening, or Xi Jinping has been strengthening his relationship with Vladimir Putin. Just before the war, Vladimir Putin was in Beijing. He met Xi Jinping, and the two of them issued a really major statement on China-Russia relations. Can you tell us, what was in this statement and how important was it?
Well, the statement was a very comprehensive account of the various things that the Chinese and the Russians agree on, and particularly Presidents Putin and Xi Jinping. It started out by saying that their two countries have more successful democracies than the West. Their governance systems are superior, and really listed many of the things that they criticize that the West is doing, like the AUKUS, the Australia, US, UK arrangement to deliver nuclear submarines, the strategies of the United States, very much criticized. But what was really most notable to me was their agreement on opposing NATO expansionism and China's support for Russia's proposals to put in place new security arrangements in Europe. These are new positions for China. So the Chinese have always opposed U.S. alliances as Cold War relics, but they have mostly focused on the alliances that are really to the east of China, particularly Japan and Korea, sometimes, of course, Australia, but they don't usually emphasize NATO. In addition, the two leaders celebrated what they called this no limits partnership. That actually is not a new term. It had been introduced in 2018 by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, but it was the first time that it was included in a joint statement between Russia and China.
So that's what you would see as, for Xi, the value of this relationship then with Russia. It's very much in antagonism then to the United States and to its alliances.
Yes, I think that the intensifying competition and antagonism between the United States and China has led to a privileging of Russia's position in China's foreign policy. It has made Russia more important for Xi Jinping. Those two leaders share the analysis of the world, I think, and the vision that the United States should play a less important role in the international order. They oppose US hegemony, and they would like, of course, the world and the international system to be more favorable to autocracies like themselves. And so this is an agenda that Russia and China have been pushing already at the United Nations, for example, as they have worked on things like cyber norms, new definitions of human rights, treaties for outer space that would protect their interests. So this partnership has grown over time, but in the last few years, as the US-China relationship has become more contentious, it has become even closer. That trend has just accelerated.
And yet you certainly couldn't call this a partnership of equals, could you? China is massively more powerful than Russia, particularly in economic terms, right?
Well, it's absolutely true that it's not an equal partnership, and that China is a much stronger player in terms of its overall GDP. I believe that when the war in Ukraine started, Russia was the 11th largest economy in the world. It's probably dropped since then and will drop further. And China is, of course, at number 2. And China's capabilities in areas of technology and innovation, I think, outstrip Russia's as well. But it's important to note that China has not treated Russia as a junior partner, and particularly Xi Jinping has given Vladimir Putin the respect that he craves. So when those two men get together, I don't think that Putin is made to feel like the junior partner. Another point is that the two countries don't agree on everything. So where they have different perspectives, such as maybe the South China Sea or the Arctic, or maybe even Central Asia, where so far China has had the upper hand in the economic area, but Russia has been more important in the security realm. But in all of those issues, they have essentially compartmentalized these areas of potential difference and not permitted them to spill over into areas where they want to work together and where they share these common interests. And that's unusual for two countries to be able to do, and yet they have been very effective at doing that.
Now, of course, Russia has initiated this war. Just before we talk about China's position on this, there's been a lot of speculation about Putin kind of gave Xi Jinping a heads up when they met that time in Beijing in early April. What's your best guess on that?
Well, I think that when the two leaders met on February 4th, just before the Olympics, Vladimir Putin himself probably did not have in mind a massive major military operation by Russia in Ukraine. So he certainly may have told Xi Jinping that he had some intention to use military forces. He may have outlined the possibility of a very short incursion, or he may not have provided details. So some people posit that Xi Jinping was snookered or played. I myself don't think that Xi Jinping felt that he was in any way lied to or misled, because I think Putin himself at that moment did not know exactly what he was going to do. Now, whether Vladimir Putin then kept Xi Jinping informed as he changed his mind, and as this notion of the major military operation, as that decision was made, that I don't know. But I think that Xi Jinping likely felt somewhat sympathetic with Russia's position, because after all, the Chinese truly believe that it is NATO expansionism, the 5 waves of NATO expansion, as they say in their statements, that is really responsible for this war. They do not blame Russia.
So now the war is underway, and it's, of course, taken on this huge scale, and it's been very, very destabilizing in the world politically, but also economically. The markets have been in turmoil. Commodity prices are soaring. That's not good for the Chinese economy. how happy or unhappy do you think Xi Jinping will be by the simple facts of what are happening now?
I think China is very uncomfortable with the current situation, in part because it has aligned itself, of course, so closely with Moscow, and the Russians are killing large numbers of civilians. This is a very bad look for China, which has just in the last day or so vetoed the International Court of Justice order to Moscow to end the war. And yet again, China sided with Russia, even as it is killing civilians. I do not think this is a comfortable position for China to be in. But you highlight another important aspect, and that is the instability of the global economy. And when Xi Jinping spoke with Chancellor Scholz and French President Macron, he also emphasized concerns about the global economy. China is, as you know, very connected to the global economy, does not want to see instability in markets, and surely would like to see an end to this war. But I would emphasize that it wants an end to this war in which Moscow is not enfeebled, Russia is not, severely weakened as a country, and so I think that that is important for China, and China has indicated that it might in some way be willing to help to bring an end to this war. But the reality is it has not stepped up. It has done very little to help bring an end to this war. But of course, as time goes on, if this war continues to rage, Chinese interests will be increasingly, I think, damaged. And Xi Jinping himself will come under criticism, not only abroad, but potentially at home. Xi Jinping faces a very important party congress in the fall, where he is slated to get a third 5-year term in office. And I am sure he does not want to put that at risk.
So could you just encapsulate the degree to which China really is supporting Russia? Because, of course, we've seen it abstain at the United Nations, in the Security Council, so in the General Assembly. You mentioned the veto on that other point. How far has it leaned towards supporting Russia really openly?
Well, I think that in the area of rhetoric, of declaratory policy, that China has sided quite clearly with Russia. Not, of course, 100%. China has an interest in the UN Charter, as it says, and defending its own or upholding its own longstanding position of protecting territorial integrity and sovereignty. China does view Ukraine as an independent, sovereign country. But China has not condemned the use of force, which it has in every other use of force that has been made, certainly by the United States, but also Russia. If we go back to the Russian and US airstrikes in Syria a few years ago, China condemned the use of force, but it has not done so in this war. And repeatedly, the Chinese talk about Russia's legitimate security concerns that should be protected. So surely China is trying to straddle, to balance its interests, but it really has sided significantly with Moscow. But when it comes to actions, that's where we are, I think, still on uncertain ground and maybe in early stages. The Biden administration has suggested that China may have already told Russia that it would provide some support for its military, but we don't know, in fact, whether that's the case. Both Moscow and Beijing have denied that. I don't think we've seen any evidence that China has tried to provide munitions or surface-to-air missiles or logistical support or intelligence, which is what has been reported in the press. We've seen no evidence yet of Chinese violation of the sanctions, which is another question. And perhaps Russia has made some asks of China, or perhaps China is looking for ways to help. China could help Russia's economy without directly violating the sanctions. And so that's another area that I think that people are watching very, very closely. But it is early days. And we know that China's commercial banks, for example, are not going to violate the sanctions, because that would put at risk their own access to the international financial system. So those aren't the kinds of things we should be looking for, but maybe smaller Chinese banks, or China lending parts of its reserves, or maybe the Chinese policy banks like the Development Bank or the Exim Bank could provide loans directly to Russian enterprises and not have to go through the banks. So there are things that China can do. And I think the Biden administration is trying to discourage China from doing anything to help Russia, even if it is not in direct violation of the sanctions. And that's where, of course, we've heard from Beijing that they have said they will conduct trade, financial interactions with Russia as normal. But words are one thing, and then actions are something else. And so we'll have to see, again, what are the decisions China makes? Does China want to basically throw in its lot with Russia? Or does it want to continue to balance these interests and try to preserve its relationship, not just with the United States, but importantly with Europe? And I think that China should see Europe as a very important player going forward, because China wants to continue to have the trade and economic ties that it has with Europe. And also, I think, sees Europe as an important pole in the international system that may not always be aligned with the United States. So we have an important EU-China summit coming up on April 1st. And I think that that's another development to watch going forward.
Now, of course, we've talked about the various areas in which China could support Russia. The military field is obviously particularly sensitive. If China did start providing some kind of military support, what would that mean? Like, how big a step would that be if China went ahead with that?
It would be huge if the Ukrainians uncovered, for example, a ballistic or cruise missile that has Chinese markings on it that had been fired by Russia. And I think that would really be a game changer in China's relationship with Russia if they provided munitions that were being used to target things like hospitals and maternity wards. This is the kind of thing we've seen reported, that the Russians are targeting civilians. And if the Chinese are complicit, I think that would just be enormously consequential in a very negative way for China's relationship with the rest of the world.
So what are we talking about? Are we talking about, a kind of a huge new Cold War scenario, the cleaving of the world into two blocks? Would we have to talk about the war in Ukraine as a proxy war between the West and China?
I think that's exactly right. I think increasingly Ukraine would begin to look like a proxy war, and that this Cold War that everybody has been denying could ever come about, not of course exactly like the US-Soviet Cold War, but a new version of it that we would have to say, yes, that's the new world we are entering. Let's
think a little bit in the other direction. What do you think it would take for China to drop Putin? We've seen Putin taking very, very risky actions. We've seen Putin and his forces targeting civilians. At what point do you think it just gets all too much for the Chinese to stomach? Are we talking about if it veers into the use of chemical or tactical nuclear weapons? Or is it just more scenes like we've seen from Mariupol, for instance?
Well, I think more scenes like what we have seen from Mariupol, I think it's not enough to change China's stance. However, if the Russians were to use chemical, biological weapons, God forbid, nuclear weapons, yes, I think that would really cause the Chinese to reconsider the downsides of siding so closely with Moscow. I think they may already, as I said, feel a bit uncomfortable. But that would, I think, just be over the top for China. I don't think that that's something that they would be able to ignore. But even without such catastrophic developments, there is the possibility of some understanding between the United States and China. And if Xi Jinping is looking for some way to perhaps distance himself a little bit from Moscow, I don't think he would cut off his relationship completely. But if he sees that it's in China's interests, I think that's what some people hope, is that he will, if we give him the opportunity to back away a bit, that he will do so. I believe that this is a proposition we probably should test. We have responsibility to the people of Ukraine and to the rest of the world to test the proposition that China is not willing to continue down this path of siding with the reprehensible actions that Russia is taking against Ukraine.
I mean, what's the smartest approach in your view from the US standpoint, but also for the Europeans? I mean, we've had, particularly in the US, there's been a bipartisan kind of growing bipartisan consensus that the United States has to push back very hard against China, that it has to rally allies to stand up against China as the predominant authoritarian power in the world. Do you see voices becoming louder in saying, well, actually, the West really has to try to hold or reach out to China to get it on side against Russia? And this being a kind of a flip of a debate that was happening previously about whether the West had to reach out to Russia to peel it away from China.
Well, I don't know that the right strategy is at this point to peel China away, but perhaps to paint for Beijing the two different pathways that they face. One, of course, is that Xi Jinping decides that he has sided too closely with Moscow, that he backs away a bit, that perhaps really does take a neutral stance, agrees to abide by all of the sanctions, even if China is unwilling to play a role in encouraging Putin to back off, that it stops playing an unhelpful role and begins to signal that it is time to bring an end to the war. The other pathway for China, of course, is a negative one, and it is one in which the United States and Europe must clearly signal to China that if it helps Russia in its military efforts, or if it aids the Russian economy, that it will face punitive measures from the United States and Europe. And let's be clear that if China is not complying with the sanctions, those measures should include secondary sanctions on China. And this is a conversation that the US and Europe, I hope, are already having. And I hope that we can be on the same page, because we all know that imposing sanctions on China is very different than imposing sanctions on Russia.
Now, if China doesn't tip so far in that direction, you mentioned earlier that China showed no sign so far of attempting to mediate, but is it to you conceivable that some kind of mediation role could emerge for China, particularly given that it is one of the few countries that might have some influence on Russia's behavior?
I do not think that we should support China playing the role as mediator, because China's not a disinterested actor. It is not neutral. It has very strong interests, I believe, in having Russia not be weakened by this war and seeing an outcome that protects Russia's vital interest. So I do not think that China should be in a position of playing the role of mediator. That said, if Xi Jinping has a private conversation with Putin and wants to encourage him to agree to more substantive negotiations and to actually reach a ceasefire and some negotiated outcome, I'm sure everybody would welcome that. But I just don't think that China is a neutral observer. I do not think it should be playing the role of mediator. And there are other countries that have stepped up, such as Israel, who probably are far better suited and far better equipped to play this kind of role.
Just a final question. In your expertise, you focus a lot on Taiwan over the years. There's been a lot of talk of comparisons between this situation and China's desire to take control of Taiwan. A lot of talk about the differences as well between the scenarios. What lessons do you feel China will be learning as this crisis plays out with a view to its aspirations on Taiwan?
We know that China studies previous wars, draws lessons from them. The Chinese military certainly studied the Gulf War and applied some of those lessons learned to its own modernization and planning. In this case, the war in Ukraine probably does carry some lessons for China, but the war is not over yet. So we cannot be clear about what lessons that it will learn. But at least from what we have seen so far, I think we should expect that China will draw some lessons from the strength of the Ukrainian resistance and recognize that even a country with a very strong conventional military advantage, such as Russia has over Ukraine, does not mean that victory can be easily secured. And of course, the other side of that coin is that Taiwan should learn the lesson itself, that it needs to prepare a civilian resistance, because Taiwan does not have a territorial defense force like Ukraine has. And Taiwan is beginning to bolster its reserves, but it really has not developed a sort of a civilian defense force. So that's interactive, the lessons that Taiwan and China themselves might draw. I think that China will also draw some lessons from the unity of the United States and Europe and Japan, South Korea, so many countries around the world that have been willing to put sanctions on Russia. Again, China is a different case than Russia, and there may not be as much willingness to impose sanctions on China. But China's expectation that these alliances of the United States are fraying and that the East is rising, the West is declining. And I think that these are wrong analytic judgments that China has made. So I hope that they, as part of these lessons, will rethink the trends in the global balance of power and their own power relative to other countries. One lesson I think China will not draw. Some people have said that because the United States did not come to Ukraine's help militarily, that it would therefore not come to Taiwan's aid militarily. And this is disinformation that Beijing actually is telling Taiwan. The United States is going to abandon you. I don't think that China will draw that lesson at all. The Chinese understand that Ukraine is very different than Taiwan is. And let's be clear that President Biden, even before the conflict started, made it clear that the United States was not going to enter this war militarily if Russia invaded. But we still continue to have a policy of strategic ambiguity, which increasingly, I think, is a likelihood that the United States would intervene, although we do not give Taiwan an ironclad commitment that we would defend it. But I think, given the growing competition between the United States and China, that it is almost inevitable that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense. So I think that China does have to factor that in. But they will watch this military operation and the future of U.S. alliances and see how the U.S. and its allies are willing to incur some costs themselves, and maybe they would do the same if China were to attack Taiwan. So they will study this for some time to come. I do not believe that Beijing has already made a decision that it must use force against Taiwan. I think that they are quite confident in their large toolkit for coercive actions against Taiwan, economic, diplomatic, militarily. They know that they can deter Taiwan from going independent. Reunification is a more long-term goal for China.
Bonnie Glaser, fascinating, a lot to think about there. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.